Welcome, everyone. This is our last session of the last day. This is the very last session of the Jewish Authors Book Festival. And I just wanted to thank, I am Lana Dennis. I work at Jewish for Good. And on behalf of Jewish for Good, I wanted to thank Jane for attending every session and the rest of the committee that helped make this amazing book festival happen. Thanks to Jewish Book Council for providing the authors.
Donna is the co-chair. Donna Goldstein is co-chair.
Donna's co-chair with Jane.
Donna and the rest of the committee.
It's okay, Lana.
And I am going to turn it over to Meg to introduce our speaker.
Right. So thank you, everybody. I'd like to remind people to go on mute. We sometimes have these events and somebody's, I don't know, doorbell rings or whatever, and all of a sudden there's a lot of background noise. And I also want to thank everybody for helping to organize this, Jane Gaben and Donna and Jewish for Good and Beth Al. And tonight we're going to hear from Joshua M. Greene, who's the author of the book Unstoppable, Siggy B. Wilsig's Astonishing Journey from Auschwitz Survivor and Penniless Immigrant to Wall Street Legend. And I looked up the author and he has so many accomplishments. I can only, tell you a few. I've read the book, so that's already, by reading the book, I could tell it was a, well-written, well-researched book. But Joshua Greene is a popular lecturer on Holocaust history. He's a former instructor at Hofstra and Fordham Universities and recipient of numerous awards for his historical biographies and documentary films. Among these, there's the bestseller, Here Comes the Sun, the spiritual and musical journey of George Harrison, and his book, Justice at Dachau, The Trials of an American Attorney, I think I had a typo there. And his renowned work on survivor testimony, Witness, Voices from the Holocaust, was the basis of a feature documentary for national PBS, named one of the best Holocaust films by Facets Media. And he's also the author of a series of Holocaust survivor memoirs for Scholastic, among other works. And I think we can then turn this over to Mr. Greene. Joshua.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you here. Thanks for setting aside a little time on a Sunday evening for our conversation. And I do hope it becomes a conversation. For me, the exciting part of these programs is hearing from people who attend what interests them. What is it that challenges them? What are the things in the story of this extraordinary human being that strike you, and what are the issues that you'd like to explore in greater detail? So please feel free to make notes. We'll proceed as follows. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of Siggy Wilsig's story with a PowerPoint that I've put together, at the end of which there's a brief documentary that you'll get to see in which Siggy speaks to you in his own words, and you'll get to hear clips from the testimony that he gave to the Spielberg Shoah Foundation just a few weeks before he passed away. And then we'll open this up to Q&A. So if that sounds acceptable to you, I'm just going to share my screen here. Bear with me a second. And then we'll get started. Okay, here. I'm learning how to do it. You can teach an old dog new tricks. It's amazing. Hold on, there we go. All right, so can everybody see that? Okay, so here we go. I'm going to start with a bit of a summary of Siggy's story, and then we'll get into the issues and themes of that story for discussion. You'll notice that in some instances I've used artwork instead of photographs of atrocities. As far as possible, I try to avoid that. It's not always possible to avoid such depictions altogether. But when I use art, it is by survivors, and you will see the names, and wherever possible, I've put a photograph so that we can honor the artist as well. Siggy Wilsig was 6 years old and just starting school in Krojanka He was born in 1926. So by 1932, Hitler has come to power and the Nazi Party has begun to establish its strength across Europe. In the town where he was born, Krojanka, things got difficult very quickly. And so by the time he was, 9 years old, he and his family escaped and went to Berlin. Why Berlin? Because it was still possible for Jews to make a living there. The Olympics were coming up in the next few years. The German people still had to be on their best behavior. There was international press and so on. But they closed schools to Jewish children rather quickly. And from the photograph you're seeing now on the screen, this was the kind of factory where young Siggy Wilzig worked. It was a munitions factory, formerly a lamp factory, where he worked 12 to 15-hour days, 6-7 days a week. And then in 1943, January, 16-year-old Siggy Wilzig, along with the other members of his family and the Jews of Berlin, were shipped by transport to concentration camp Auschwitz. And on arrival in Auschwitz, he had the horrible experience of seeing his mother and family members marched off to the gas chambers. He lost track of his father at that point. We'll learn about his father's fate in a moment. Siggy was spared because he invented, when the guard asked him, "How old are you?" he invented an answer that was a bold-faced lie. He said, "I'm 18 years old." He was not. And then when he was asked, "Do you have any skills?" he said, "Well, I'm a master toolmaker," which he was not. And that kind of resourcefulness, knowing what to say, what not to say, where to go, where not to go, characterized his entire life, as you will soon discover. By the way, the book only spends about 75 pages on these difficult years in Nazi-occupied Europe. The rest of the story is what happened to Siggy after he came to America. Siggy was sent to a barrack where, because he spoke German, he could understand the guard yelling "Mützen auf, Mützen on," meaning cap on, cap off. The other prisoners from his transport who didn't speak German were considered insubordinate and disobeying orders for not knowing to take their cap off. So the guard in the camp, whose name was Kaduk, beat 3 of them to death. That was the first day of his arrival in Auschwitz. There were about 3,800 people on that transport. He was only one of a handful who survived that first selection. Most people are unaware that between 1933 and 1945, the Nazi Party opened more than 40,000 camps. Let me repeat that, 40,000 camps. Concentration camps, labor camps, prisoner of war camps, transit camps, killing centers. Auschwitz was the largest, with nearly 10,000 acres of land. Now, Siggy's day started at about 4 o'clock in the morning with the roll call, or the appel, and then he was sent with other prisoners to work on details that lasted, as I said, 12, 15 hours a day, as had happened in the forced labor workshop in the suburbs of Berlin. And for Siggy, this meant digging ditches, laying cables, and hauling bricks to build access roads to the camp. To stay alive, he invented skills, as I mentioned. When he heard guards saying that they needed experienced bricklayers, he volunteered for that. When he needed to work indoors because he had started to develop pneumonia and had to get out of the cold, he lied again and said that he was a doctor's assistant, and the guards put him to work in the prisoner hospital. And it was in the hospital that he found his father, who had been savagely beaten and was on the brink of death. Now, that same day, here's a picture of his father, Isidor Wilzig. That same day, the guards in the hospital ordered Siggy to serve grated potatoes out to all the patients, which Siggy thought, okay, well, that's a good deed. I can feed them some food. They're all starving. What he didn't know was that the potatoes had been poisoned. The guards were essentially getting rid of prisoners in the hospital who were less likely to recover and making room for the less sick prisoners so that they could come in, regain some strength, and be sent back out to work. So Siggy told this story for the first time in December of 2002, just 2 months before he died. And he described for the interviewer that I think I helped to kill my father. He had never told that story, even to his family, and yet he lived with that memory throughout all his life. Here you see a picture of his mother and father in Berlin. This is taken in about 1932, just briefly before the family fled to, this was in Krojanka, just briefly before they fled to Berlin. Well, one particular day in Auschwitz, there was a guard who was violently drunk and yelled at Siggy and other prisoners, "Who can sing?" Now, nobody was in a particularly singing mood, but Siggy calculated that this guy was a madman and he might kill all of them if someone didn't step forward to sing. So he stood up and began singing and dancing. And when he finished, the guard walked up and handed him a stale slice of bread. So here's what's important about this particular story. The daily diet for prisoners in the camps was about 700 calories a day, which is starvation level, and an extra slice of bread could save your life. Siggy described, however, to his interviewer many years later that it was a calculated risk because what if he didn't like my singing? The point being that inside the camps, prisoners never knew whether anything they did would save their life or get them killed. There was no particular rhyme or reason. We can discuss later how it is that there's a tendency to glorify survival as though it embodied some kind of nobility of spirit when the survivors themselves do not talk about heroics and heroism or themselves as heroes, but talk about the humiliating and embarrassing things they had to do just to stay alive. Here's a photograph of Siggy on the left with a friend, Larry Nartel. Larry was 6 years older than Siggy when they met inside Auschwitz. And at the time, Larry was working in the prisoner warehouses where valises and suitcases and duffel bags and other belongings from prisoners arriving in Auschwitz were sent to be sorted through. The clothing was put into one pile, eyeglasses in another, shoes in another. And in these bags, you could also find valuables, money, gold, watches, bracelets, rings, sometimes medicines. So Larry saved Siggy's life by sneaking him into work in the warehouse and giving him a chance to collect some of this contraband, which then they traded for things they needed to live, whether it was additional food or sometimes a small piece of soap with which to stay clean. Staying clean was another important part of staying alive in a place like Auschwitz. Well, Siggy had a chance to return the favor when he and Larry were forced on what later became known as the Death March from Auschwitz, which took place in January of 1945. By that time, the operators of the camp could hear the Russian army approaching from the west. You could hear the bombardment and the shells. So they knew the end was near. And in order to hide as best they could the evidence of their crimes inside the camp, they took whatever remaining surviving prisoners there were and forced-marched them to camps deeper inside Nazi-occupied Germany and in Austria. So on this death march, the guards would march the prisoners all day, and at night they would tell them to lie down in the snow. The guards, of course, took a comfortable place in a nearby barn where there'd be some heat. But when the guards were no longer there and they couldn't see, Siggy took stock of where he was, where he and Larry were, and noted that the shoelaces on his wooden clogs had deteriorated in the wet and snow and slush, and that that was a problem. If he lost his shoes, he would get frostbite and he would die. If his shoes were not held tight because he didn't have shoelaces, they would slide up and down on his heel, and a splinter from a wooden shoe could kill you because your body, so weakened and emaciated from this 700 calories a day diet in Auschwitz, did not have the resources to fight infection. So he looked and saw that there was some tree over on the side. Here you see what happened to the prisoners who were unable to keep up with the death march. Here's a photograph of what a pair of the kinds of shoes that Siggy wore looked like at that time. He saw a little birch sapling off in the distance, and the guards weren't looking, so he crawled over to this tree, and with the edge of a spoon that he had kept from Auschwitz, he scored strips of bark from the tree. Then he rubbed them together between his palms to warm them up. He braided them together into shoelaces, tied them around his shoes, and gingerly walked and stepped on the shoes and found that indeed the bark was holding. And Siggy, who was a very devout Jew, a believing Jew, said later that must have been the Almighty. Where else would an idea like that come from that would save your life in a place like Auschwitz or on a death march? So by the time that the Americans arrived in Mauthausen, which was where Siggy's death march ended, he was weighing less than 90 pounds. And he and Larry recovered by spending time in a prisoner hospital, Red Cross hospital. And after they had regained some strength, they volunteered to work for the U.S. Army Central Intelligence Corps, or the CIC, as it was called. This was the agency that Simon Wiesenthal worked for, gathering evidence of war crimes, tracking down operators of the camps and others who held positions of authority in the Nazi administration. It was during Siggy's time working for the for the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, that he had what we might call an epiphany. He described that in the camps, one of the big questions was, is there a God? Seeing what they saw, going through what they went through, it was a real issue. If there was a God, some said he's not around anymore. He certainly couldn't be caring about us now. So it was a quandary. Siggy, who never gave up his faith, described the following story, that his job for the CIC took him on his first plane ride. And it was a cloudy day. And the plane took off and burst through that cloud bank. And on the other side of the clouds, the sun was shining and there was a beautiful, bright blue sky. And in that moment, he said, God was talking to me. And God was telling me, don't give in to the despair. I'm still here. He said, sometimes a dark cloud like Hitler gets between us, but please know that I am still here. And in that moment of witnessing that bright sun on the other side of the clouds, Siggy said his faith was confirmed. It was in December of 1947 that 21-year-old Siggy Wilzig arrived in America. He disembarked. It was a very cold winter, December of 1947. And there was the greatest blizzard in 50 years going on in New York. He boarded a Greyhound bus that dropped him off here at this place, Hotel Marseille, on Broadway and 103rd Street, which had been turned into temporary quarters for immigrants and refugees and survivors arriving from Europe. And on that first snowy day, blizzardy day in America, Siggy looked out his window and made 3 vows. He said, first, I'm never going to go hungry again. Somehow I'm going to make sure I never go hungry again. Second, I'm going to marry a Jewish woman. We're going to have Jewish children, and I'm going to help rebuild the Jewish people. And third, he said, I will always speak up whenever I witness injustice. Well, he had no money. I mentioned to you a moment ago that the schools had been closed to Jewish children quite early, so he never had an education past grade school. He didn't have anyone sponsoring him, no one to help, but he'd lived through the worst that humanity had to offer, and he was fearless, as time would prove, and unstoppable. If the book had not been called Unstoppable, I probably would have called it Fearless, because as you'll see, that very much typified Siggy Wilzig. His first job in America, and you'll hear him talk about this in the film that we're going to see at the end of this PowerPoint. His first job was shoveling snow for $2 a day. By the second day, he'd found a young man willing to do the job for $1. So basically, he was exercising his business skills and earning a profit from his first day in America. From there, he graduated to cleaning toilets in sweatshops. And from the sweatshops, he graduated to selling neckties. Now, meanwhile, here's the romance. Here's the love story part. There's always a good love story in these things. Meanwhile, in Newark, New Jersey, a fruit and vegetable vendor, who also served as the local matchmaker, met a young college student named Naomi Sisselman. And he looked her up and down and said, you look like a colored moil. You look like a very marriageable young lady. Do you mind if I give your name and number to one of my other customers? He's just come from Europe. His name is Siggy. Obviously, this was a full service fruit and vegetable business. Naomi said, fine. Siggy showed up and he said, I don't own a $5,000 car, so I'm coming to pick you up in a $40,000 bus. Naomi liked that. Siggy's sense of humor was not only part of his charm, it was a very powerful weapon for earning customers when he finally took over an oil business and a bank. We'll get to that in a minute. They were married, and well, technically they eloped because Naomi's parents were a little suspicious of someone who had managed to survive Auschwitz. But he proved himself to them. He took over as manager of a furniture business and doubled the business in something like 2 weeks. And with the commissions he earned from these various jobs, he started buying stock. And he found he taught himself how to read the stock reports, and found this sleepy little company in Texas called Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, and met someone in at a party, at a gathering in Newark, who was a more sophisticated investor and said, I own stock in Wilshire as well. I like you. You've got some moxie. Would you help me in a takeover of this company? I think we can grow this oil company if you help me. This is a golden opportunity for someone who had only been earning commissions selling neckties to get into some serious money. So he corralled neighbors and friends and the few remaining family members he had and got them to buy stock. And eventually Siggy took over the company, became its president, CEO, and chairman of the board, grew it from something like $800,000 a year to $80 million a year, and then realized that he would need some cash flow. If you're going to grow a company like Wilshire, where profits from oil and gas take a long time to realize, you need a strong cash flow. So an advisor said, if you found a bank, that would work. Banks have a lot of cash. So Siggy Wilzig then went looking for a bank, and he found a good candidate in Trust Company of New Jersey. To make a long story short, took over Trust Company with that same kind of what he called fox-like intuitions, knowing what to do, how to position things, and built Trust Company to a point where by the time he was done, by 1971, at age 41, he had become the youngest chairman and CEO and president of any major bank in New Jersey. And by the time he was finished, he had built his companies up to the point where they had assets of more than $4 billion. Now, one of the things that I would love to tell you, apart from about Siggy's business prowess, is his wicked sense of humor. Some of this you're going to have to get from reading the book. We don't have enough time to get into it all here. But one quick story, if you look, you see that watch fob hanging from the pocket of his vest. People would say, what is that? It's so pretty. He said, oh, that's my Phi Beta Kappa key. I got that when I graduated Oxford University. You went to Oxford? Well, technically, I started at Yale here in the States. Then I went to Oxford and then did some graduate work at Cambridge as well. Really? He said, schmuck. I didn't go to any of those schmuck. Everyone was a schmuck. That was his title for everybody. He said, I never went to college. I barely finished grade school. I was in Auschwitz. You were in Auschwitz? That's the opening that Siggy wanted. He wanted a chance to educate people about the Holocaust, and he dedicated the rest of his life to doing just that. Here you see him in front of his headquarters in New Jersey. So we're examining the thoughts and the mental processes of a former, of a Holocaust survivor whose mind worked at about 100 miles an hour. And the book also explores his fight with the Federal Reserve. Say at this time, we're talking early 90s now, America was going through some serious inflation, and President Reagan alerted the country that he was going to be taking some severe austerity measures, including getting companies that were not banking companies to divest themselves of their banks. Trust Company was not a bank. Wilshire Oil was not a banking company, and yet they owned a bank. So according to this campaign by the Federal Reserve, Siggy had to decide whether to keep Wilshire Oil or keep Trust Company Bank, but he could not keep both. So just to kind of give away the ending of the story, he lost the battle with the Fed. But he lost the war with the Fed, but he lost the battle and won the war. That's what it was. I'll let you read what happened. But he sued the Federal Reserve, and in its profile, Forbes magazine said, what's so surprising about fighting the Federal Reserve? When you've stared down the Gestapo, what's the Fed? Well, there was one other important accomplishment that Siggy was very proud of. Elie Wiesel, a fellow survivor of Auschwitz, invited Siggy to work with him to build the Washington Holocaust Museum, which he did. He became a founding member of the Museum Council. And as a founding member, Siggy and his wife, Naomi, were invited to dine with President and Mrs. Carter. So 30 years after his arrival in America as a impoverished, uneducated refugee, Siggy Wilzig was the guest of the President of the United States in the White House. Now, there's just one other story I'd like to tell you before we get to the short film where you'll get to hear Siggy talk to you in his own words. The turning point came in 2000 when Siggy was diagnosed with stage 4 multiple myeloma, which is an incurable blood cancer. And the one achievement he had not yet made was telling his story. His son, Ivan, whom you see here in the middle of this photograph, and that's Ivan's younger brother, Alan, on the left, heard that Steven Spielberg was going to be at a fundraiser in the Hamptons. So he bought tickets, cornered the famous director, and said, look, Mr. Spielberg, you've got to interview my father. He's dying. He's the most articulate survivor you'll ever interview. He knows your friend, Elie Wiesel. Your sister, Nancy, is married to his rabbi, Leon Katz's son. Ivan had prepared his pitch very, very well. Spielberg said, well, even though we've technically closed our interview part of our program, we do make exceptions sometimes. Give me your card. And in August of 2002, Siggy, freshly coiffed and dressed in a neatly pressed jacket and shirt, received the crew in his apartment in Fort Lee, and he began what turned out to be one of the longest testimonies in the entire 50,000 testimony collection of the Shoah Foundation. By this time, the aggressive anti-cancer drugs had begun to take a toll, and his voice was not as powerful as it was in his younger years. And I'll ask you, as you're watching the film that's about to begin, look at the difference between Siggy as he is speaking in the testimony that he's giving to the Shoah Foundation and the little clip that you're going to see of him speaking at Livingston Synagogue some years earlier, and you'll get a sense of what he was like when he was at the peak of his strengths. So I'd like to, as I said, conclude by allowing you to hear Siggy speak to you in his own terms. So if you'll give me just a moment here, I'm going to start that video. Let's see if I can get this right here. All right. This lasts about 14, 15 minutes.
The more I remember. I'm trying to get away from the past, but it isn't possible. I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day.
I was born in 26 in Krojanke. It was West Prussia, about 155 miles northeast of Berlin. 4,500 people, and I would think there were about 1,500 Jews. My mother's name was Sophie, and my father's name was Isidore. My mother was an Orthodox woman. My father made a little living. He bought hides with 2 horses and a wagon. In 35, we left everything, and the next morning we were in Berlin. There was an immediate change when Hitler came to power. You had already the sons joining the Nazi party. Well, I was beaten up regularly. Kristallnacht, I was 12 years old. As a child, when you see synagogues burn, Jewish homes go up in flames, and the police not doing anything, it was like the end of the world. It was forced labor run by the army. It used to make lamps before the war, and I worked on a lathe. I was 14 and a half years old, and I worked 72 hours. How much more can you do? They called it evacuation. That was the word. For instance, I was picked up in the middle of the night, 2:30, 3 o'clock, from this Lampenweber, from this forced labor that I did. When the trains pulled up, I looked out of the window. I know we were going east. But going east didn't mean Auschwitz. We didn't know there was an Auschwitz. So we arrived the night of March 3rd, bitter cold. I saw flames coming out only about 150 feet away from the train. So I thought it was a brick factory. I didn't know that people would be burned and gassed. To have been born as a Jew in Germany, to get beaten, to get hard labor, all of that. But the gas chambers, no. That you didn't expect. Where 10,000 people could be gassed in one night. The smell, that is a little bit hard to describe because there is no other smell like this. Have you ever seen people being burned? Have you ever smelled them? Neither did I. You see in my arm what the Nazis did. 104, 732. The little triangle, only for Jews. The selection was really a dastardly, terrible situation. My mother was immediately murdered in the gas chamber. My father was badly beaten, and my father died in front of me. The Auschwitz one was the main camp. The main camp are brick buildings, block by block. And 10 was the experimental, where the women went in and the women didn't come out. Please do not ask me what kind of experiment. I think the Germans had a word, unmenschlich, unhuman. How did I find a way to live? If you didn't find out what I found out, you would be dead. There was no other way. I looked for every opening that they could possibly use someone like me, and I overheard something about bricklayers. I became an instant bricklayer. I did it for about 6 months. They needed someone in the laundry. I never worked in the laundry in my life, but I got away with 3-4 months. How did you survive 2 years of Auschwitz? It was not my education, which I didn't have any. It was my brain, which I didn't have much. It was the hand of God. The Death March began on the 17th of January. We left Auschwitz and we started to march 150, 160 miles. It was a combination of open cattle cars and walking. It was winter time. We huddled together. The first stop was Gleiwitz, a major center for coal and for metal. When the doors opened, a sight that I will never forget. We were sent to Vienna, to Melk and to Steyr. Our marching ended in Mauthausen. And when we were taken into the small shower room, we actually felt you would be gassed when you hear the clicking of the metal. That's something that stays with you forever. Somebody pointed on top of a hill a uniform I'd never seen, the American khaki uniform. They broke down the gates. That's where I was liberated. I had fever and sickness and everything else. I weighed 82 pounds. I left Europe November 29th, 47, and arrived in America December 12th, 47. what kind of work did I do first when I came to this country. Next, I was the original glue sniffer, putting glue on the back of leather bags for $28 a week. Oh, next I became an experienced leather salesman. My mind was made up that I can sell better than anybody else. Naomi Sisselman. We got married March 1454 in the Little Hungary on Houston Street. The whole dinner was $12.95, including the plaster flower. In 6 or 7 weeks, I went from salesman to general manager. I won the business and doubled it. What did I do next? I acquired control of Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, a little oil company. I bought it piece by piece by piece by piece. The Rothschild in me went to the bank, the Trust Company of New Jersey, a 100-year-old institution. I was only the second Jew to become a president of a bank. The Jews were not bankers. Maybe there were a couple of savings and loans, but not of major size. Commercial banking particularly was a fiercely anti-Semitic business. They think because I'm a refugee and because I never went to school, I didn't even graduate public school, that how the hell do I become a president of a bank? I did it anyhow. I'm the president of a $4 billion bank. I was born to be president. If there's an organization that has anything to do with the Holocaust, I address the organizations, I give money, and I insist that my children go. People that speak about it, and we're not there. They have to take the best from books, from studying, from movies, from theater. But when you were there, at a young age, then it stays with you.
When I see what I went through and hundreds of thousands of others that are not here to tell you, so I speak for them. I have that right. I have that obligation to speak for them because we're a dying breed and too many people are telling you there was no Holocaust. Never can anyone describe the scene. If you hear it 1,000 times, the chances are you are not capable of believing it.
What kinds of nightmares do you have?
Very bad. Can't even talk about. It's something that is there. You are in Auschwitz every day. I'm going to tell you something that I don't think I ever said. As terrible as it sounds, I don't think I could live without the nightmares. It gives me the very ultra realistic difference between life and death. It shows me what life is now, particularly as a Jew, and that I didn't give it up, what I am. I wouldn't want to be anything else. If I would have to go through, God forbid, the same thing, I would go through the same thing as a Jew.
Well, that gives you an idea of the kind of person we're dealing with here. And let me just, before we open this up to your questions, let me just mention that we've reached a point historically when, because the survivor generation is all but gone, the testimony by witnesses to the Holocaust, such as the one that Siggy gave to the Shoah Foundation, memoirs, biographies such as Unstoppable, have an even greater importance because it is through the experiences and memories of those who were there that we have an opportunity to peer inside this universe to find some sense of what we're capable of doing on the dark side, and what someone like Siggy reminds us we humans are also capable of doing, having come through that darkest of times, what is possible at the other end. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you here this evening. Let's now open this up, and if you have questions, is someone going to monitor the chat box? Alana, you or someone else, perhaps you can read off the questions.
Yes, I'm gonna read the chat box, but there's nothing there so far. Anybody, we want
Norma's
that
hand
many.
is up.
Yeah.
Norma, go
I
ahead.
wanted to say something. Thank you so much for this very informative and interesting presentation. I actually met Ziggy Wiltzig in New Jersey. I was involved in leadership in the northern New Jersey region of Hadassah for many, many years, and we honored him with the Myrtle Wreath Award, which is kind of a Henrietta Zold award that was given to distinguished people every year. And what I found so interesting about him and other survivors who had gone through similar experiences, and this is in New Jersey, so I can't speak for all over the world, or all over the United States, there were a good number of people like Ziggy, like the Kushner grandfather, the original Kushner, not the son and Jared, but the Kushner who came here as a refugee, and several other individuals who came out of this terrible Holocaust and became extremely successful, whether it was in real estate or in finances. And yet, as a social worker, when I was working in New Jersey, I worked with a lot of Holocaust survivors in Paterson, New Jersey. And clearly there were people who were simply marginal. They could never really get their life beyond a certain point. And yet there were other individuals who went beyond. I mean, my daughter-in-law's grandfather was like that too. He wasn't as well known as Ziggy, but he was certainly came from nothing and, you know, built a sizable business. And what is this inner strength that distinguishes people to come from such a traumatic experience and yet to be able to rebuild their life? And with Ziggy in particular, he came here, he couldn't have been able to speak English that well. How did he move into all of these jobs and get involved with Wilshire? That's what I find so interesting.
Well, he had a facility for language. He picked that up also in the camps, where learning to speak Russian, a little bit of, can't remember, there were 4 or 5 languages that he taught himself just by listening and interacting with other prisoners inside the camps. He picked up the language. And of course, it was a requirement. It was a necessity once he came to America. He would listen to documentaries on the History Channel. He was an avid student of newscasts, and really taught himself by bootstrapping his way up with learning English. Now, there's one of the 100 or so people I interviewed for this book said that when he got into business, that's when his voice became Shakespearean. He had this extraordinary oratory skill that hypnotized people. When he spoke, you really couldn't blink. So far as the first part of your question, it's tempting. Let me issue a caution here. It's tempting to try to find some kind of element that unifies the survivor experience that would explain this phenomenon that we call a survival. But if we just stop the theorizing and listen to what the witnesses have to tell us, we don't find a survivor syndrome. We don't find some kind of generic condition that they all suffer from or benefit from. What we hear is individual men, women, and in some instances, children, who describe their reactions and what they went through in a highly personal way. And I think it's critically important that we be aware of our own tendency to look for some kind of a salutary quality in survival, as though survivor itself were some kind of act of heroism. You don't hear the survivors talking about themselves as heroes. You talk about the unheroic and sometimes very humiliating things they had to do just to stay alive. And even Siggy, who was a very devout Jew, will say that it was luck, a combination of luck, circumstances, and the hand of the Almighty. He never claimed credit for being somehow a better survivor than the others around him. And I think every time we do that, every time we glorify survival as though it somehow distinguishes these individuals from the others who perished, we run the risk of exposing our own prejudices, that it says more about our need for closure than it does about the realities of history. I remember one group here on Long Island who said, would you help us with a film we want to produce about survivors on Long Island? I said, okay, show me some of your material. And they showed me a promotional flyer that said, these men and women embody all that is noble of the human spirit. They are the reminder for us of the will to survive time out. The 6 million who didn't survive, they didn't have a human spirit. They didn't have a will to survive. You know, they didn't have the dignity of, I mean, we have to be careful about that kind of language. So That said, I must confess to you that I do believe, having spent 8 years writing this book about Siggy Wilzig, that we cannot discount completely the agency that individuals had under certain circumstances in the camps, whether it was, in Siggy's case, the ability to invent a persona for himself that got him a job that saved his life, or whatever it was. But I would stop short of trying to give that a name as though it were some kind of psychological predisposition that people had.
No, I wasn't trying to infer that. I am very aware that the ability to stay alive was simply luck, regardless of, look, you could have had somebody who was very clever. They could just as easily have been killed as
That's
not.
right. That's
But
right.
what I was speaking to is many, the individuals that were lucky enough to be able to survive and came to the United States. There were a group of many of them have died already, of individuals who were able to
Yes.
acclimate
Yes.
in a way that some people couldn't.
Sure.
I guess that's true for anyone who lives through a trauma.
Well, you're correct. There were many survivors who came to America and did extraordinarily well. You mentioned the Kushner family. There's the Panteras. There are so many families that came out of those dark times, and I suppose it's reasonable to conjecture that because they had survived the worst that history had to offer, they were bold in their business endeavors. They had that sense of, what's the point in having survived if I don't do something big and help restore the Jewish people, which was Siggy's motivation. He didn't want to get rich. He wanted to build a platform from which people would have to listen when he talked to them about the Holocaust. But certainly, there's something to be said for, I think it was Nixon who used to say that the hardest steel comes through the hottest fires, or something like that. But we just need to be cautious about categorizing people into better or worse prepared to survive. So thank you. It's a good question.
Someone else? No. So I didn't know about Siggy. I'm not from Northern New Jersey and so on. So what led you to write a biography of Siggy?
There had been about a dozen biographies prior to this one, for middle grade readers for Scholastic. Mm-hmm. A book called Witness Voices from the Holocaust, which was a collection of testimonies that described life before, during, and after the Nazi era, based on testimonies at the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies at Yale University. That's where I'm affiliated. I'm on their board of advisors. And I frankly didn't think I was going to write another book. I'd had enough. My wife saw me moping around the house with my chin on the ground. She said, you better find something else to write about. That's when I ended up writing that biography of George Harrison, whom I had the pleasure of knowing briefly back in the early 1970s. And that was just fun. That was just pure fun. When the phone rang 8 years ago and Siggy's son, Ivan, said, I think you're the guy who's going to write my father's story. I've read some of your other books and I like them very much. I tried to dissuade him, but like his father, Ivan learned to never take no for an answer. Mm-hmm. So he pursued me, let's say. And the more I learned about Siggy, the more I researched, the more it was clear that this is a story that needs to be told. So it took a long time because there were so many people who knew him and wanted to be heard and deserved to be heard. Family, friends, fellow members of his synagogue, employees of his companies, officers of his companies, former customers of his companies, and so on. There were a lot of people, and they all had a Siggy story to tell.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, he certainly seems so larger than life, and really until that last illness, sort of still at the height of his powers.
Yeah, in him, I found someone whose qualities I would hope to emulate in my own life. You know, not just a wicked sense of humor, which I admire, but also a good heart. I mean, he was a tough man. His children will back me up on that. But his heart was made of gold. And someone who never had time for anything other than work would stop everything he was doing if he heard that somebody was in trouble, and he'd reach out and help them. We need those exemplars in our life, especially right now when we're confronting a horrible situation instigated by a man who lacks those human qualities. And I suspect that we will see in years to come testimony of victims of the current war crimes being perpetrated on the Ukrainian people. The testimony of witnesses and survivors is critically important for our understanding of history.
Yeah. Anyone else?
It's not unusual, I find, in these presentations for there to be a kind of silence at the end of it. We're dealing with something that's so overwhelming, you know, a time in history that has baffled much greater minds than mine in terms of understanding what happened and how people can reach such a low point in their behavior toward one another. But it's important that we talk about it no matter how difficult it is, because we need to remember Holocaust memory is critical, so that, particularly for young people, but for everyone, that we can recognize the signs and be prepared for interceding so that such things never occur again. And I know I take great satisfaction in thinking that Siggy is looking down and smiling, seeing his story making the rounds and doing well, I might add. I'm very proud of that the book has been well received, and that his life story is educating people about the Holocaust. I think he'd be very happy about that.
Is that Jane?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that to what you said, Joshua, and that it's also important that we keep talking about this, because, you know, while we don't understand the mindset that could have caused this originally, the Holocaust, just as it's inconceivable that there are people today who say this never happened.
Yeah.
And that segment of the population seems to be growing. It's not lessening, and so we have to keep coming back at them with critical information. But I also want to say that I think the figure of 6 million is used too loosely, and that's only the Jews. It's 12 million. When you add in all the other groups that the Nazis victimized and killed, there were 12 million victims of all faiths. It's true that the Jewish group was designed for annihilation, but it just started with them.
Yes, you're right.
Yes.
You're right to mention that. And if we add in the total number of people killed as a consequence of World War II, we're up to 50 or 60 million. So you're right to mention others. And you're also right to mention that it was the Jews who were uniquely designated for total elimination, for total extermination. And that was a big issue when the Washington Holocaust Museum was being designed. Should the museum focus on the particularity of the Jewish dimension of the Holocaust, or should the Armenian genocide and other such atrocities be somehow incorporated curatorially into the exhibits? That was a point of hot debate when the museum was first being formulated. Thank you.
Yeah. I can just share that several people just said to you things like, thank you for an engaging discussion, and thank you for writing this book and telling Siggy's story. I really enjoyed reading the book. So that's what our chat has brought us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Every time I get to do this, I feel that it's my reward for having spent some years putting the story in writing, because it gives me a chance to meet with lovely people like you. And I'm challenged by your questions, and I'm informed by your comments. And so thank you very much for your hospitality and your invitation.
Yes, it's been very nice hearing about this.
Thank
My
you.
understanding is that we're at about the end of our time together. So maybe if you have another project underway, we'll keep our eyes out for it too.
All right. Well, there's another middle grade book for Scholastic coming out in about a year or so.
Very good.
So,
Okay.
so
Good.
thank you again very much. I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and
Good night.
I hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.